They found the killer through his fingerprints. The dental impressions were a perfect match. The blood spatter told the whole story of the murder. You've heard these phrases countless times on crime shows and in news reports. The reality is that the forensic science you've trusted all these years isn't really science at all. In a groundbreaking 2009 report, the National Academy of Sciences dropped a bombshell on our criminal justice system. Most forensic disciplines lack proper scientific validation. The techniques that have sent thousands to prison, many to death row, aren't based on rigorous science, but on unproven assumptions, outdated methodologies, and subjective interpretations. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the disturbing reality behind forensic science and the wrongful convictions it has caused. And once you hear what I'm about to tell you, you'll never look at crime scene investigations the same way again. The revelation that shook the justice system. In 2009, the National Academy of Sciences published what would become one of the most important documents in modern criminal justice history, Strengthening Forensic Science in the United States, A Path Forward. This wasn't just another academic report gathering dust on a shelf. This was a scathing critique of practices that had been used to convict people for decades. The report's conclusion was stunning. With the exception of nuclear DNA analysis, no forensic method has been rigorously shown to have the capacity to consistently, and with a high degree of certainty, demonstrate a connection between evidence and a specific individual or source. Let that sink in for a moment, because you heard it correctly. The fingerprint analysis that's been used since the early 1900s, the ballistics comparisons that link bullets to guns, the bite mark evidence that's helped convict dozens of defendants. According to the NAS, none of these techniques had been scientifically validated to the standards we would expect from actual science. But why should we care? Because people's lives and freedom hang in the balance. The Innocence Project has identified forensic science errors as a contributing factor in 52% of wrongful convictions later overturned by DNA evidence. Real people have lost decades of their lives because of techniques that are no better than a coin flip, and sometimes even worse. We'll discuss each forensic discipline one by one and explain not only the bizarre history of many of them, but how they are unproven and scientifically unsound. By the end of the video, we'll reveal that absolutely absurd reason why this evidence is allowed in a court of law to this day. Fingerprints, not the gold standard you think they are. You've seen it 1,000 times on TV. The detective runs a fingerprint through a database and gets a perfect match. Case closed. But the reality is far more complicated and concerning. Fingerprint analysis, or latent print examination, involves a human examiner comparing a print found at a crime scene with a known print. But there's a critical flaw in this process. It's subjective. Two different examiners might reach different conclusions about the same prints. In a shocking real-world example of this fallibility, Brandon Mayfield, an Oregon attorney, was wrongfully arrested for the 2004 Madrid train bombings based on fingerprint evidence. FBI examiners claimed his prints matched those found at the scene with 100% certainty. They were 100% wrong. Spanish authorities later matched the prints to someone else entirely. The problem? Fingerprint analysis isn't based on statistical probabilities or quantifiable standards. There's no scientifically established number of matching points required to declare a match. Instead, it relies on an examiner's judgment and experience, what scientists call subjective interpretation. As the NAS report stated, fingerprint analysis needs more rigorous protocols for examining fingerprints and clear standards for determining what constitutes a match. Until then, we should question its reliability as evidence that can send someone to prison for life. Bite mark analysis, a forensic fairy tale. If fingerprint analysis is problematic, bite mark analysis is a forensic nightmare. This technique involves matching the patterns of teeth found in bite marks on skin to a dental impression from a suspect. The NAS report was particularly harsh on bite mark evidence, stating that the field lacks scientific validation and has no evidence of an existing scientific basis. Yet, before this report, bite mark evidence was routinely admitted in courts nationwide. Perhaps even more shocking? Bite mark evidence was first used to convict a man named George Burroughs in 1692. George was a minister in Salem, Massachusetts during the horrific period of the Salem witch trials. He was accused of witchcraft and torture, including biting his victims. He was paraded around the courtroom where a so-called expert pointed out the crookedness in his teeth and how it was conclusive evidence of his guilt. George Burroughs was convicted and sentenced to death. Just before he was hanged, George shocked the crowd that had gathered to watch. He began to recite the Lord's Prayer. The crowd gasped because, according to the Bible, witches are not supposed to be able to say the Lord's Prayer. Nonetheless, Burroughs was executed. 20 years later, it was proven beyond a reasonable doubt that George was in another town when his alleged crimes occurred and that he could not have committed them. He was posthumously exonerated and his family received compensation from the state. That set a legal precedent for the use of bite mark evidence in court. Fast forward 300 years. The case of Ray Crone, who was convicted of murder in 1992 based primarily on bite mark evidence. An expert testified that Crone's teeth matched marks found on the victim. After 10 years in prison, DNA testing proved his innocence and identified the real killer. The fundamental issues with bite mark analysis are profound. Human skin is a poor medium for recording dental impressions due to its elasticity and how it changes after injury. The temperature of the skin, movement of the person being bitten, and even blood pressure can significantly affect the bite impression. There's no scientific research proving that human dentition is unique. Studies show alarming disagreement among forensic odontologists when analyzing the same bite marks. In fact, a 2021 study by the National Institute of Standards and Technology found that bite mark analysis lacks a sufficient scientific foundation because its three key premises are unsupported by data. Despite this, courts still admit this evidence, and that needs to change. Ballistics, matching bullets without scientific standards. Firearms examination, commonly known as ballistics, involves comparing markings on bullets or cartridge cases to determine if they were fired from a specific gun. It sounds scientific, but like many forensic disciplines, it's fundamentally subjective. When a firearm expert testifies that a bullet matches a specific gun to the exclusion of all other firearms in the world, they're making a claim that's scientifically indefensible. There's simply no statistical basis for such a conclusion. And one of the most famous crimes in American history laid the groundwork for ballistics evidence over 100 years ago. The famous gangster Al Capone was the kingpin of the early 20th century in Chicago. If it was illegal and made a profit, Al Capone was involved. However, he had a hard time pushing back against the Irish mob. In a bold and terrifying move, his crew had obtained some police uniforms and staged a police raid. Once the members of the Irish mob were lined up outside, Capone's men opened fire and murdered the entire crew. This infamous scene became known as the Valentine's Day Massacre. Everybody knew who was responsible, but there was not a shred of evidence to back it up. Until Dr. Calvin Goddard entered the picture with his groundbreaking new science, or so he thought. Goddard claimed he could match a gun to a bullet or shell casing by examining the marks left by the firearm. He said these marks were 100% unique and could be used as evidence. After 2 weapons were recovered from the home of Fred Burke, a suspect in the case, Dr. Goddard began his tests by firing rounds from those weapons, examining the marks, and then examining the casings recovered from the scene of the crime. He claimed they were a perfect match. However, as with fingerprints and bite mark impressions, this was completely open to interpretation with no scientific standards established then or now. The NAS report emphasized that the scientific knowledge base for toolmark and firearms analysis is fairly limited. Without established error rates or statistical foundations, there's no way to know how reliable these comparisons truly are. Yet juries are profoundly influenced by such testimony. When an expert claims to be certain about a match, it carries enormous weight in the courtroom, potentially overshadowing other evidence that might point to innocence. Blood spatter analysis, more art than science. Blood spatter analysis seems impressively scientific. Analysts examine the patterns of blood at a crime scene and make determinations about what occurred. the position of the victim, the type of weapon, even the number of blows. The expert testifies in front of the jury. He explains angles and geometry, and it all sounds complex. But it turns out the beginnings of this practice are more like something from a fiction novel than real-world science. Dr. Herbert McDonnell was in his basement in New York on a summer night. A gunshot rang out. A cadaver was hung up several yards away. He aimed a pistol and fired a shot. He then walked up to the canvas surrounding the body and began to examine the blood stains. Herb used this method and similar ones to develop his theories on blood pattern recognition. Eventually, he started an unaccredited school from his basement and called it the Bloodstain Evidence Institute. People would travel to his home to learn what they believed were cutting-edge methods, some of them even shooting cadavers themselves under controlled conditions. But the NAS report found that the uncertainties associated with bloodstain pattern analysis are enormous, and that many analysts' conclusions are more subjective than scientific. The viscosity of the blood or blood thickness is vastly different from a dead body due to the process of coagulation, the thickening of blood that happens once the heart has stopped. Factor in different surfaces on which the blood lands, and you have a scenario where there are so many possibilities that no reasonable amount of certainty could honestly be put forth, let alone be testified to in a court of law. In 2021, the largest study to date on bloodstain pattern analysis revealed disturbing findings. Researchers found that when 75 practicing bloodstain pattern analysts examined the same bloodstains, 11.2% of their conclusions were wrong when the cause was known, and analysts contradicted each other 7.8% of the time. You may be under the impression that one must attend university and go through rigorous training to get certified as a blood spatter pattern analyst. That couldn't be further from the truth. The shocking reality is, you can take a 40-hour course and be certified to testify to a jury as a quote-unquote expert. The David Cam case illustrates the dangers of this subjectivity. Cam, a former Indiana state trooper, was tried 3 times for the murder of his family, based largely on blood spatter evidence. Prosecution experts testified that 8 small drops of blood on his shirt were high-velocity impact spatter from the shootings, while defense experts insisted they were transfer stains from contact with his daughter's body when he discovered the crime. Even once another serial murderer confessed, the blood pattern evidence was still put forth as evidence of David's involvement. After 13 years and 3 trials, the bloodstain evidence was refuted, thrown out, and Cam was finally acquitted. It's important to understand that while entertainment may strive for a sense of realism, it should never be taken for reality. I implore you to do your own research and ensure that if you are ever selected for jury duty, that you be an informed, conscientious juror. Arson investigation, where folk science sent innocents to death row. Perhaps no area of forensic science has been more thoroughly debunked than traditional arson investigation. For decades, fire investigators relied on a set of indicators they believed proved a fire was intentionally set: crazed glass, burn patterns on floors, and the intensity of a fire. The problem? Scientific experiments have proven that these indicators appear in accidental fires too, particularly after a phenomenon called flashover, when a room becomes so hot that everything in it ignites almost simultaneously. The most tragic case is that of Cameron Todd Willingham, executed in Texas in 2004 for allegedly setting a fire that killed his 3 children. Modern fire scientists have concluded that the evidence used to convict Willingham was invalid. The fire was likely accidental. The arson evidence was the only evidence used to convict Mr. Willingham. Before he was given a lethal injection, he looked out of the glass and stated, "The only statement I want to make is that I am an innocent man, convicted of a crime I did not commit. I have been persecuted for 12 years for something I did not do. From God's dust I came, and to dust I will return, so the earth shall become my throne." As arson expert John Lentini has noted, "What I knew about arson, some of it was wrong. What a lot of people thought they knew about arson was wrong." Yet despite progress in fire science, old myths persist in courtrooms across America. Hair analysis, the FBI's embarrassing admission. For decades, FBI analysts testified that microscopic hair comparisons could link defendants to crime scenes with near certainty. In 2015, the FBI made a stunning admission. Their hair analysts had provided flawed testimony in 96% of cases reviewed. This wasn't just an academic concern. Of the 268 trials with flawed hair analysis testimony identified by the FBI, 32 defendants received the death penalty, and 14 were executed or died in prison. The fundamental problem? There was never any scientific research establishing that hair characteristics are unique to individuals. Yet analysts routinely testified as if they could make definitive identifications, offering statements like, "The hairs are microscopically indistinguishable and therefore could have come from the same source." To a jury member who is ignorant to how these alleged experts testify, that sounds like a definitive statement. What the testimony should sound like is as follows. In my subjective analysis, in which I used a special microscope to view the two hairs side by side simultaneously, they appear to be indistinguishable and could have come from the same source. However, I cannot make the definitive conclusion that they did come from the same source. The NAS report concluded that testimony linking microscopic hair analysis with particular defendants is highly unreliable. Despite this, courts still admit this evidence. The human factor, cognitive bias in forensic science. Beyond the methodological problems with various forensic disciplines, there's an even more fundamental issue: human bias. Forensic analysts don't work in a vacuum. They're often aware of other evidence in the case, which can unconsciously influence their findings. For example, a fingerprint examiner who knows that a suspect has confessed might be more likely to find a match between that suspect's prints and those found at the crime scene. This is called contextual bias, and it's a well-documented phenomenon in forensic science. Even more concerning is the institutional bias that can arise when forensic laboratories are run by law enforcement agencies. Scientists who work closely with police and prosecutors may feel pressure to produce results that support the prosecution's theory. It's a bias that occurs simply from working around the people for whom you're expected to deliver these results. Following the scientific method would require that all testing be done in a blind scenario, meaning that the forensic examiner does not know who the suspect is or any theories surrounding the crime. They should only know the minimum factual details necessary to complete accurate findings. The NAS report recommended creating an independent national agency to oversee forensic science, separate from law enforcement, to address these structural biases. More than a decade later, this recommendation remains largely unimplemented. Why courts keep admitting flawed science? If there are so many problems with forensic science, why do courts continue to allow it as evidence? The answer lies in a legal standard established in the 1993 Supreme Court case, Daubert v. Merrill Dow Pharmaceuticals. Daubert requires judges to act as gatekeepers for scientific evidence, determining whether it's reliable before admitting it. In theory, this should filter out junk science. In practice, judges rarely exclude forensic evidence, often deferring to precedent rather than scrutinizing the scientific validity of the techniques. Many judges don't want to be the person who creates the proverbial wave that disrupts the court system and makes it harder for prosecuting attorneys to get convictions. There's also a troubling asymmetry in how Daubert is applied. Studies show that judges are more likely to exclude scientific evidence offered by defendants than by prosecutors. This creates a double standard that disadvantages those facing criminal charges. Add to this the fact that public defenders often lack the resources to hire expert witnesses who could challenge forensic evidence, and you have a system where flawed science continues to play a role in convictions despite its known limitations. And as long as we elect judges and prosecutors who don't understand these limitations, the cycle will continue. The exception that proves the rule. In the midst of all these problematic forensic disciplines, there is one bright spot: DNA analysis. The NAS report recognized DNA testing as the gold standard of forensic science, the only discipline with the necessary scientific foundation and statistical validity. But even DNA evidence isn't infallible. Contamination, mixtures of multiple people's DNA, and subjective interpretations of complex samples can all lead to errors. In 2015, the FBI admitted that its statistics on DNA match probabilities contained errors that had been repeated in thousands of cases. What makes DNA different from other forensic disciplines is its grounding in statistics and population genetics. When an analyst says there's a 1 in a billion chance that DNA came from someone other than the suspect, that statement is based on actual data about how DNA varies in human populations. This statistical approach is what other forensic disciplines lack. Without it, claims of matches or identifications remain scientifically unsound, regardless of how confidently they're presented in court. The path forward, real science in the courtroom. The NAS report wasn't just a critique, it offered solutions. It called for standardized protocols, proficiency testing for forensic analysts, research to establish error rates, and statistical frameworks for expressing the certainty of conclusions. Peer review for tests and independent governing bodies of forensics. Some progress has been made. The National Institute of Standards and Technology has been funding research to strengthen the scientific foundations of various forensic disciplines. Some laboratories have implemented blind verification procedures to reduce bias, but adoption of these reforms has been inconsistent, and funding for forensic research remains inadequate. Meanwhile, people continue to be convicted based on forensic evidence that lacks scientific validation. As consumers of true crime content and potential jurors, we have a responsibility to understand these limitations. The next time you hear an expert testify with absolute certainty about a forensic match, remember the NAS report's warning about the lack of scientific foundation behind such claims. Ask questions. Be a conscientious juror. Demand to know how they can be so certain. Request the testing protocol. Hold their feet to the fire. The human cost, lives destroyed by flawed forensics. Behind each wrongful conviction is a human being who lost years, sometimes decades of their life. And for each wrongfully convicted person, there's often a victim who never received justice because the real perpetrator remained free and oftentimes created even more victims that may never know peace. Consider the case of Keith Allen Harward, who spent 33 years in prison based on bite mark evidence that was later disproved by DNA testing. Or Han Tak Lee, who served 25 years for the alleged arson murder of his daughter before fire science advances proved the blaze was accidental. These aren't just isolated incidents. They represent a systemic failure that continues to this day, despite what we know about the limitations of forensic science. Conclusion: a system in need of reform. The 2009 NAS report was a wake-up call for our criminal justice system. It revealed that practices we had long accepted as scientific were often anything but. More than a decade later, we're still grappling with its implications. Real science embraces uncertainty, acknowledges limitations, and quantifies the probability of error. Too often, forensic science as practiced in courtrooms does none of these things. Examiners make absolute statements unsupported by research, hiding the subjective nature of their conclusions behind a veneer of scientific authority. For our justice system to truly serve justice, this must change. We need forensic disciplines grounded in rigorous research, transparent about their limitations, and expressed in statistical terms that jurors and judges can understand. Until then, we should approach forensic evidence with informed skepticism, recognizing that the definitive matches and identifications portrayed on TV rarely exist in real life. The stakes, people's freedom, and sometimes their lives are too high for anything less. If you found this video eye-opening, check out our other video on false confessions, another leading cause of wrongful convictions. The truth about our justice system may surprise you even more.